He thought the house was empty, silent, forgotten, left behind like the life he tried to escape. But the moment he opened the door, everything stopped. Inside were two small children and a young black mother who clearly didn't belong there, yet had nowhere else to go. His hand tightened around his phone. One call could erase them from his life forever. But what he saw next forced him to confront something far bigger than trespassing, something about power, prejudice, and humanity that America still struggles to face. The choice he made in that moment would change every life involved. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe to Stories of Racism and connect with us for daily new stories. Because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Andrew Wellington's life ran on schedules, numbers, and control. Every morning began the same way. Medications lined up on the counter, black coffee untouched until his hands stopped shaking, and financial reports waiting on a tablet that never left his side. For decades, this rhythm had made him powerful. It had turned a poor boy with nothing into one of the wealthiest men in America. Buildings rose because he decided they would. Entire neighborhoods changed because his signature sat at the bottom of a page. Respect followed him everywhere, except in the quiet moments when no one was watching. At 67, Andrew was supposed to be slowing down. That was what the doctors said after the heart attack that dropped him to the floor of his Nashville office just 2 months earlier. They called it a warning. He called it an inconvenience. Still, for the first time in his life, his body had forced him to stop. 12 weeks of rest, no stress, no boardrooms, no late-night deals. And so, reluctantly, he returned to the house he had bought years ago but never lived in, a modest place tucked away near the Tennessee hills, far from the glass towers that defined him. The house represented a version of life Andrew never chose. It was meant to be full of laughter, family dinners, and grandchildren running through the yard. Instead, it had sat empty, quietly decaying, much like the parts of Andrew he never allowed himself to feel. Walking up the driveway after 6 long years, he told himself this stay was temporary, just a place to recover, just a roof, nothing more. What Andrew didn't expect was to feel like a stranger in his own life. The house looked different, not abandoned, not forgotten. Flowers bloomed where weeds once grew. The porch was sturdy. The windows were clean. Even before stepping inside, something felt off, like the house had been claimed by someone else's story. At the same time, just a few rooms away from where Andrew would soon stand, Kesha Thompson was trying to keep her life from unraveling again. Her days were measured in survival, childcare schedules, bus routes, shift changes, and exhaustion that never fully went away. Since her husband's sudden death 2 years earlier, everything had been a fight. First the job, then the apartment, then dignity. Living in a car with 2 small children had stripped away any illusion of safety she once had. Finding the abandoned house hadn't felt like theft. It felt like a last chance. Kesha did what she had always done when life pushed her into corners. She worked. She cleaned. She repaired what she could. She made the house livable not just for herself but for her children. To her, this place wasn't stolen property. It was shelter, stability, a fragile pause from a world that never gave her room to breathe. But Kesha knew pauses never lasted. She lived every day with the same quiet fear that someone would come back, that the space she tried to turn into a home would be taken away in an instant. As a black woman with 2 children and no legal claim, she understood how quickly sympathy could turn into suspicion, how easily survival could be reframed as wrongdoing. Andrew and Kesha existed in 2 completely different worlds, shaped by power, race, and opportunity. One built empires. The other fought to keep her children warm at night. They were never meant to meet. Yet the moment Andrew stepped back into that house, their lives collided in a way neither could have imagined. What began as a return to rest would become a test of character, a moment that exposed how easily privilege decides who belongs and who doesn't, and a choice that would force Andrew to confront something far more dangerous than a fragile heart, the truth about himself, and the system that had always protected him. Because when power meets desperation, the outcome is never simple, and what Andrew was about to face inside that house would change everything. The moment Andrew stepped fully inside the house, tension settled into the air like a held breath. His body reacted before his mind did. His heart rate spiked, his chest tightened, and a familiar fear crept in, the same fear that followed him since the heart attack. This was not how recovery was supposed to feel. He had come here for silence, control, and order. Instead, he found noise, movement, and lives already in progress. Children's toys lay scattered across the living room floor. The space that once echoed with emptiness now pulsed with warmth and activity. And standing at the center of it all was Kesha, frozen between fear and defiance, instinctively positioning herself as a shield. Andrew saw it immediately, the way her body curved protectively, the way her eyes flicked toward her children before settling on him. It was a posture learned through hardship, through years of knowing that danger rarely announced itself politely. Andrew's first instinct was ownership. This was his house, his property, his space. Years of wealth and authority had conditioned him to believe that problems could be removed with a phone call, and for a brief moment that belief surfaced again. He felt the weight of power in his pocket. One call would restore order. One call would remind everyone exactly who he was. But the longer he stood there, the harder it became to separate right from legal, possession from humanity. Kesha felt the imbalance immediately. She had lived her life under it. She knew the look of a man who had options when she had none. She knew how quickly her presence could be redefined, from mother to intruder, from survivor to criminal. Every muscle in her body remained alert, ready to respond, ready to protect. She had repaired the house, cleaned it, nurtured it, but she also knew that none of that mattered in a world that rarely gave grace to women like her. Andrew's anger flared, then faltered. He noticed details he hadn't expected to notice. The clean floors, the fresh flowers, the care. This wasn't neglect disguised as shelter. This was effort, intention, pride. The house had been transformed in ways he had never bothered to do himself, and that realization unsettled him more than the trespassing ever could. As the reality of Kesha's situation surfaced, the tension shifted. Her story wasn't dramatic or rehearsed. It was quiet, worn down by repetition. A husband lost suddenly, work slipping away piece by piece, rent piling up faster than hope, nights spent calculating how long gas would last, how to keep children warm, how to keep fear from showing on her face. Andrew had negotiated billion-dollar deals with less complexity than the life she was trying to hold together. Still, his instinct to protect himself fought back. He was weak, recovering, vulnerable. Stress was dangerous. Complications could kill him. Every warning from his doctor echoed in his mind. This situation was a risk, one his body could not afford. And yet, sending a mother and her children back to a car felt like crossing a line that money had insulated him from ever seeing before. The decision he made in that moment to give time instead of punishment felt temporary, controlled, a compromise, 2 weeks, a deadline, a boundary he could live with. But even as he spoke it, something shifted. The house was no longer a place he merely owned. It had become a shared space, heavy with unspoken consequences. The days that followed were defined by careful distance. Kesha stayed invisible whenever possible. She moved through the house like a guest who feared overstaying her welcome. Early mornings, late nights, quiet footsteps. Andrew observed it all, pretending not to. The tension lingered in every hallway, in every shared silence. 2 lives intersecting without trust, without understanding, bound together by circumstance and unequal power. Then Andrew's health collapsed again. It started subtly. Fatigue heavier than usual, a burning throat, a fever that blurred the edges of the room. He tried to ignore it as he had ignored everything else in his life that demanded care. But isolation has a way of amplifying vulnerability. When his strength failed, there was no assistant, no driver, no nurse waiting on call. There was only Kesha. What followed stripped both of them of pretense. Kesha stepped into a role she never intended to fill, not out of obligation but instinct. She recognized the signs immediately. She had seen this before. She had lived this nightmare. And the fear that surged through her was not abstract, it was personal. Every hour Andrew weakened mirrored memories she had tried to bury. Another man, another fragile heartbeat, another chance to lose someone while standing helpless nearby. She monitored him relentlessly, measured time in temperature checks, watched his breathing, adjusted his position. The power imbalance that once dominated the house inverted quietly. Andrew, the billionaire, became dependent, exposed, human. His wealth meant nothing in those hours. His authority could not lower a fever or steady a pulse. Andrew felt the shift, too. He had never been cared for like this, not patiently, not without expectation. The woman he had nearly reported was now the one ensuring he survived the night. And that realization unsettled him far more deeply than illness ever could. He was forced to confront the truth that the system he benefited from would have discarded her without hesitation, even as she refused to discard him. As the fever worsened, so did the emotional stakes. Kesha stayed awake when exhaustion begged her not to. She chose vigilance over rest, fear over self-preservation. Every spike felt like a countdown. Every shiver carried the weight of past losses. She wasn't just fighting for Andrew's life. She was fighting her own history. And Andrew saw it. In fleeting moments of clarity, he noticed the tremor in her hands, the shadows under her eyes, the determination etched into her face. This was not charity. This was something deeper, something raw. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how rarely people like him were required to be brave in quiet ways. When the fever finally broke, relief flooded the house, but it did not erase what had happened. The lines between owner and intruder, benefactor and burden, had blurred beyond recognition. What remained was connection forged under pressure, under fear, under injustice that neither of them could ignore anymore. But the deadline still loomed. 11 days. And with every passing hour, it became clearer that survival had changed the rules. What began as a temporary allowance had become a moral reckoning. Andrew could feel it settling in his chest, heavier than illness, heavier than regret. Because the real conflict was no longer about who owned the house. It was about who would be forced to leave it, and what that decision would say about power, race, and the cost of compassion in a world that rarely rewards it. And the hardest choice was still ahead. The days after Andrew's recovery passed with a quiet intensity that felt heavier than the illness itself. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. No raised voices, no confrontations. Yet beneath the calm, tension tightened with every hour. The house held too many unspoken thoughts, too many questions without answers. Every shared glance carried weight. Every silence felt deliberate. Andrew began noticing things he had never trained himself to see before. Not numbers, not outcomes, people. He noticed how Kesha counted everything: minutes, groceries, bus fares, energy. How she rationed rest like it was a luxury item. How she flinched whenever a car slowed outside, her body instinctively bracing for judgment. This wasn't paranoia. It was experience. Andrew had lived his entire life buffered from it. He also noticed Jamal. The boy watched him carefully with a mix of curiosity and caution. He didn't trust Andrew yet, not fully. Children sense power even when adults tried to disguise it. Jamal spoke softly, kept his movements small, as if trying not to take up too much space. Andrew realized with a jolt that the child behaved the way employees did around him in boardrooms: careful, respectful, restrained. No 6-year-old should carry that kind of awareness. Kesha, meanwhile, moved forward as if the deadline were a physical wall she could see approaching. She woke earlier, took extra shifts, made phone calls late at night, whispering into the kitchen so the children wouldn't hear desperation in her voice. Each rejection hardened her resolve while quietly draining what little hope remained: affordable housing, safe neighborhoods, flexibility for a single mother with unstable income. The answers were always the same: no availability, no exceptions, no mercy. And beneath every conversation hung an unspoken truth she knew too well: that as a black woman, her margin for error was smaller. that landlords would smile politely and then stop returning calls, that her story would be heard not as resilience, but as risk. She didn't say it out loud, but Andrew began to recognize the pattern. He had benefited from a system that extended grace to him automatically. She had survived one that demanded perfection and still punished her. Andrew wrestled with himself during long, restless nights. He told himself he was being practical. He reminded himself of his health. He repeated the word temporary like a shield. But the truth pressed in from every direction. He had already crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had seen what his absence, his privilege, his indifference had allowed to exist just beneath his awareness. The house had become a mirror, and Andrew didn't like what it reflected. One afternoon, while Kesha was gone and the children were with Miss Dorothy, Andrew wandered into the back garden. The soil was freshly turned. Herbs grew in neat rows. Someone had invested care here. He realized the garden had been revived with the same patience Kesha gave everything else in her life. It wasn't just survival, it was dignity. And that unsettled him deeply. Later that evening, Andrew overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. Kesha on the phone, her voice low, controlled, cracking only slightly. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking for time, explaining gaps in employment, explaining why her credit didn't tell the full story, explaining why she wasn't dangerous, irresponsible, or careless, explaining herself. When the call ended, Andrew heard the quiet sound of defeat. No crying, just a long exhale. He understood then how exhausting it must be to constantly justify your existence. The tension reached a new level when a letter arrived. A formal notice, a routine reminder of property ownership and occupancy, legal language that reduced lives to terms and clauses. Andrew read it twice, then sat motionless. This was the system working exactly as designed, neutral on paper, devastating in practice. If acted upon, it would erase Kesha's fragile stability in a matter of days. He folded the letter slowly, feeling the weight of choice press harder than ever. This was the moment power revealed its true nature, not in grand gestures, but in quiet decisions made behind closed doors. Kesha sensed the shift immediately. She always did. She saw it in Andrew's posture and the way he avoided her eyes. Fear tightened her chest. She had lived this pattern before, the calm before loss, the politeness before removal. She prepared herself without complaint, began packing small things discreetly, clothes folded tighter, toys placed back into bags. Andrew watched her do it and felt something fracture inside him. The injustice was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name. Children who asked questions he didn't know how to answer. He could no longer pretend neutrality. Inaction would be a decision. Silence would be complicity. But choosing differently carried consequences he had never been forced to face before. What would it mean to intervene? To disrupt the rules that had always protected him? To acknowledge that the same system that rewarded his ambition had punished her survival? The pressure mounted as the days ticked down. Each morning felt like borrowed time. Each night brought the same question: who would leave this house changed, and who would leave with nothing? Andrew stood at a crossroads he had never imagined. For the first time, wealth offered no clear advantage. Influence provided no easy answer. This was not a negotiation he could win. It was a reckoning he had to face. And as the deadline drew closer, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever decision Andrew made next would not just determine where Kesha and her children slept. It would reveal who he truly was, and whether compassion could exist where power had always ruled. The pressure inside the house became almost tangible as the deadline crept closer. It wasn't spoken about openly, but it shaped every interaction. Time moved differently now, each day shorter, each night heavier. Andrew found himself listening more than speaking, absorbing the quiet rhythms of a life he had never been forced to notice before. Kesha's days blurred together in a cycle of effort and restraint. She worked harder, not because it would change the outcome, but because stopping felt like surrender. She calculated every dollar, every mile, every hour of sleep. Even small moments of relief came with guilt. If she laughed with her children, it was brief. If she rested, it was restless. Survival had taught her that comfort was temporary and often followed by loss. Andrew watched all of it with growing unease. He had always believed effort guaranteed results. That belief had carried him from nothing to everything. Yet here was a woman doing everything right, working relentlessly, sacrificing endlessly, and still facing the same closed doors. The system did not respond to her discipline the way it had responded to his ambition. And that realization chipped away at the story he had told himself his entire life. The children became impossible to ignore. Jamal's questions grew more cautious as the days passed. He asked about school schedules, about routes, about where they might go next, but never directly. He was too young to fully understand displacement, yet old enough to sense it coming. Zoe, blissfully unaware of timelines and legalities, clung to routine. She carried her stuffed bear everywhere, as if instinctively anchoring herself to the idea of home. Andrew felt the weight of their presence in unexpected ways. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, small shoes by the door, crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator. These details unsettled him because they made the consequences of his decision visible. Eviction was no longer an abstract term. It was Jamal packing a backpack too carefully. It was Kesha waking before dawn to cry silently where no one could hear her. Miss Dorothy noticed the shift too. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs of a storm before it broke. Her glances toward Andrew grew sharper, less patient. She spoke less, but when she did, her words carried the weight of history. She had seen men like Andrew before, men who didn't consider themselves cruel, yet benefited from cruelty all the same. Andrew felt judged, though no one openly accused him. That judgment came from within. He found himself replaying moments from his past with new clarity, deals that displaced families, developments that raised rents, boardroom conversations where communities were reduced to markets and opportunities. He had never considered race explicitly in those moments. He hadn't needed to. The system had done the sorting for him. Now that system stood in his living room. One evening, Andrew sat alone in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling as his heart thudded unevenly in his chest. Not dangerously, just enough to remind him of his mortality. The cardiologist's warning echoed again. Stress was a risk. Complications were dangerous. He could still choose the easy path. He could enforce the deadline, restore order, protect his health, and walk away convinced he had been generous enough. But something stopped him. He thought about the illness, about how helpless he had felt, about Kesha's steady presence when his wealth meant nothing, about how easily the roles could have reversed if circumstance had tilted slightly differently. And he realized that for the first time he was afraid, not of dying but of living unchanged. Downstairs, Kesha sat at the kitchen table late into the night, paperwork spread before her, apartment listings, budget calculations, notes scribbled in the margins. Each page represented another compromise, another step down, another risk accepted because there were no safer options left. She told herself she was being realistic, but realism felt a lot like defeat. She didn't hate Andrew, that surprised her. It would have been easier if she did. Hatred was simple. This was complicated. Andrew wasn't cruel, he wasn't loud, he wasn't violent. He was just powerful, and power didn't need cruelty to do damage. It only needed indifference. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. As the final days approached, the house seemed to hold its breath. Even the children grew quieter. Andrew sensed that whatever decision he made would ripple far beyond this moment. This wasn't about charity or generosity. It was about whether systems could be challenged in small, personal ways, or whether they were too entrenched to touch. The tension peaked when Andrew overheard Jamal speaking softly to his sister one night, promising her they would be okay, promising her mama always figured things out, promising things no child should feel responsible for guaranteeing. Andrew stood frozen in the hallway, listening to a 6-year-old carry the weight of uncertainty with forced bravery. That was the moment something inside Andrew finally broke. He realized that neutrality was no longer possible, that doing nothing was not safety, it was harm delayed. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that racism did not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrived quietly, hidden behind rules, policies, and deadlines that looked fair on paper but crushed people in practice. Kesha, sensing another shift, prepared herself for the worst. She had lived through enough disappointments to know better than to hope. Hope had betrayed her too many times. She told herself she would accept whatever came next with dignity. She would protect her children. She would survive. She always had. But survival was exhausting. Andrew stood at the edge of a choice that would redefine his understanding of justice. Not the kind debated in courts or argued on television, but the kind lived out in kitchens, bedrooms, and quiet moments when no one was watching. The deadline loomed like a final bell. And as the house settled into uneasy silence, one truth became painfully clear. This was no longer about property or permission. It was about whether one man, shaped by privilege and power, was willing to confront the injustice he had never been forced to see, and whether compassion could outweigh the fear of disrupting a system designed to favor him. The next decision would change everything, and there would be no going back. The morning the deadline slipped into single digits, the house felt smaller. Walls that once held warmth now pressed inward, as if time itself were tightening its grip. Andrew noticed it the moment he came downstairs. The air was heavy, not with conflict, but with anticipation, like something inevitable inching closer no matter how slowly anyone moved. Kesha was already awake. She always was. She sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched, staring at nothing. Her mind was somewhere else, running through contingency plans, rehearsing worst-case scenarios, preparing herself for the moment she would have to explain everything to her children in words that wouldn't break them. Andrew watched her quietly from the doorway. He had never been good at these moments. He had spent his life making decisions in rooms where no one showed fear, where consequences were abstract and delayed. Here, the consequences breathed, slept, and waited. Later that day, Andrew drove into town for the first time since his illness. The trip was meant to clear his head. Instead, it sharpened everything. As he passed neighborhoods he had invested in, he saw them differently now. The rising rents, the new developments, the polished storefronts that pushed out families who had lived there for generations. He had called it progress, growth, revitalization. He wondered how many people like Kesha had been quietly erased in the process. The thought followed him home and refused to let go. That evening, a subtle shift occurred, one that neither Andrew nor Kesha could fully explain. Andrew sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. He asked about Jamal's school, about Zoe's favorite foods, about work schedules and bus routes. The questions were gentle, but they carried weight. Kesha answered carefully, wary of reading too much into curiosity. She had learned the cost of misinterpreting kindness. Yet something in Andrew's tone felt different, less distant, less guarded. Still, Kesha did not allow herself to hope. Hope had a way of making loss sharper. The next few days unfolded in quiet preparation. Kesha began sorting belongings more deliberately, separating what could fit into bags from what would have to be left behind. Andrew noticed small absences. A picture moved, a toy no longer on the floor, a plant transferred into a smaller pot, evidence of departure appearing piece by piece. Each item removed felt like a question Andrew had failed to answer. Miss Dorothy, never one to hide her thoughts, watched Andrew with measured scrutiny. She didn't lecture him. She didn't confront him. She simply existed as a reminder of community, of history, of consequences that outlived good intentions. When she spoke, it was rarely direct, but it landed all the same. She talked about neighbors forced to move, about children pulled from schools mid-year, about families scattered because rules were enforced without empathy. Her stories weren't accusations. They were warnings. Andrew listened. At night, Andrew lay awake replaying conversations, moments, silences. He thought about the word fair, how often it was used to justify outcomes that were anything but. The law was fair, the deadline was fair, the market was fair, and yet fairness had somehow always tilted in his direction. He began to understand that racism did not always announce itself through hatred. Sometimes it lived in systems that rewarded people like him while quietly exhausting people like Kesha. Systems that required no malice, only compliance. Meanwhile, Kesha's anxiety manifested physically: tight shoulders, shortened breath, headaches that never fully faded. She told herself to stay focused, to stay strong, but the emotional strain seeped into everything. Even moments with her children felt fragile, as if joy itself might be taken away for being too loud. Jamal asked fewer questions now. He had learned to read the room. Zoe sensed it too, clinging closer, seeking reassurance without knowing why. Kesha held them both tighter at night, memorizing their warmth, bracing for the uncertainty ahead. Then came the evening that shifted everything again. Andrew found Kesha alone on the back porch, staring out into the dark. She hadn't heard him approach. Her posture was tired, unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. For a moment, Andrew considered retreating, preserving her privacy. Instead, he stayed. They didn't speak at first. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just heavy. Andrew finally understood that whatever he chose next would not be a gesture. It would be a statement about who deserved stability, about whose lives were allowed room for recovery, about whether power could be used to protect instead of exclude. Kesha felt his presence and turned, bracing herself. She expected formality. She expected distance. What she saw instead unsettled her. Andrew looked conflicted, human, not like a man about to enforce a rule, but like someone standing at the edge of a truth he could no longer ignore. Neither of them knew how to bridge the gap yet. Words felt premature, but the moment lingered, charged with possibility and fear. Inside the house, time kept moving. The calendar did not care about conscience. The deadline did not soften. Each passing day brought them closer to a decision that could not be undone. Andrew knew that whatever he chose would follow him for the rest of his life. Not as a headline, not as a transaction, but as a measure of who he became when faced with injustice he could no longer pretend wasn't his concern. And Kesha, standing on borrowed ground, knew that the next answer she received might determine not just where her family slept, but whether the world would finally make room for them to exist without apology. The rising tension had reached its breaking point. What came next would not be quiet. The night before the final week began, a storm rolled in without warning. Rain battered the roof, wind rattled the windows, and thunder cracked so loudly it startled Zoe awake. She cried out in confusion, and Kesha rushed to her side, gathering her into her arms, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. Storms had always unsettled her. They reminded her how quickly things could fall apart, how little control anyone truly had. Andrew listened from upstairs, heart pounding, not from illness, but from the weight of everything pressing down at once. The storm outside mirrored the one inside the house. He found himself standing at the top of the stairs, listening to Kesha soothe her child, feeling like an intruder in a moment of tenderness that had nothing to do with him, and yet everything to do with the choice he was avoiding. By morning, the storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered. Fallen branches littered the yard. Mud streaked the walkway. The house looked vulnerable again, exposed to the elements. Andrew stepped outside slowly, careful with his still healing body, and stared at the damage. Without thinking, he began clearing debris. It was physical, grounding work, something he hadn't done in years. Kesha noticed from the window. She hesitated, then joined him, keeping a cautious distance. They worked side by side in silence. No negotiations, no timelines, just effort. For a brief moment, the power imbalance softened. Two adults maintaining the same space. Two people responding to the same storm. That fragile equilibrium shattered later that afternoon. A car slowed in front of the house. Not a neighbor, not Miss Dorothy. The driver lingered, then wrote something down before pulling away. Kesha saw it from the kitchen and felt her stomach drop. She recognized the pattern. Someone had noticed. Someone had reported. Fear surged instantly, sharp and familiar. She didn't say anything to Andrew at first. Panic had taught her to prepare quietly. She gathered documents, birth certificates, school papers, anything that proved she was a mother doing her best, not a threat. Jamal sensed the urgency and grew silent again, retreating inward. When Andrew noticed the change, it was too late to pretend nothing was wrong. The reality of scrutiny hit him hard. This wasn't just about his decision anymore. This was about how quickly society policed the existence of people like Kesha, about how neighbors tolerated abandonment for years but reacted instantly when a black family occupied space that was meant for them. Andrew felt anger then, real anger, not defensiveness. It burned hotter than fear. He realized how insulated he had been. No one had ever questioned his right to take up space. No one had ever driven by slowly to see if he belonged. Kesha finally told him what she'd seen. Her voice was steady, but her eyes gave her away. She was bracing for impact. Andrew could see it, the reflexive readiness to be blamed, removed, erased. That night, neither of them slept. Andrew sat alone in the living room, lights off. The house quiet except for the ticking of the clock. Every second felt louder. He thought about the system again, about how quickly it mobilized against the vulnerable, how slowly it responded when harm flowed the other direction. He had spent decades benefiting from that imbalance without ever numbing it. Upstairs, Kesha lay awake holding Zoe, staring into the dark. She prepared herself emotionally for another displacement, another explanation, another reset. She reminded herself she had survived worse. She always did. But survival came at a cost, and she was tired of paying it alone. Morning arrived with no answers, only heavier silence. Andrew knew that delay was no longer neutral. Waiting was no longer harmless. The longer he hesitated, the more damage he allowed. He could feel the moment narrowing, like a door slowly closing. Kesha felt it too. She moved carefully, quietly, as if already halfway gone. Each step through the house felt temporary, provisional. She avoided eye contact, not out of disrespect but self-preservation. The rising action had reached a dangerous edge. Because now, the choice Andrew faced wasn't just moral, it was urgent. The system was circling. Time was no longer theoretical, and whatever he decided next would determine whether this house became a place of refuge or another point of trauma in a life already heavy with them. The storm had passed, but the reckoning was just beginning. The knock came just after noon. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The sound cut through the house with surgical precision, sharp enough to freeze every movement inside. Kesha felt it first, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. Her hands went cold. Her chest tightened. That single knock carried the weight of every eviction, every threat, every moment she had ever been reminded that she did not fully belong. Andrew heard it too. He stood in the hallway, heart pounding, instinctively aware that this was the moment he had been circling for days. The moment delay could no longer soften. The moment neutrality collapsed. Kesha moved quickly, automatically. Jamal was pulled close, Zoe lifted into her arms. Her voice stayed calm as she whispered reassurances, but her body betrayed her. She had been here before. She knew how fast everything could unravel. Andrew reached the front door before she could stop him. Two men stood on the porch. Clean clothes, clipboards, polite expressions hardened by procedure. Not police, yet but close enough. Neighbors had complained. The property had been flagged. Questions needed answers. Andrew felt the weight of their gaze shift the moment he spoke. Their posture changed. Their tone softened. Respect entered the conversation like a silent password, Ownership mattered, wealth mattered. His presence reframed the situation instantly. Kesha saw it happen. She watched the same system that scrutinized her suddenly bend around him. No suspicion, no urgency, no raised voices, just courtesy. She stood behind Andrew holding her children, invisible again in a different way, present yet irrelevant to the authority now shaping her fate. Andrew listened as they explained the issue: unauthorized occupants, liability, standard procedure, nothing personal. The language was clean, neutral, efficient, designed to erase human consequences behind paperwork. Then they asked him the question: was she allowed to be there? The world narrowed. Andrew felt the house go silent behind him. He didn't turn around, but he could feel Kesha's presence, her fear, her restraint, her readiness for rejection. He understood in that moment that the power to define reality sat entirely with him. One word could collapse her life. One sentence could send her children back into instability. This was the worst of it, not cruelty, not violence, authority disguised as fairness. Andrew's heart thudded painfully. He remembered his doctor's warning: stress kills. He remembered the fever, the weakness, the hands that steadied him when he could not stand on his own. He remembered what it felt like to be helpless, and who had stepped forward when he was. He also remembered every time he had benefited from silence. The men waited, pens poised. Andrew took a breath that felt like crossing a line. "Yes," he said, "she's allowed." The air shifted instantly. The men hesitated, clarified, asked again just to be sure. Andrew repeated it, firmly this time. He stated that Kesha and her children were his guests, that he had given permission, that any issues would be handled directly with him. Procedure had no answer for conviction backed by power. The men exchanged glances, nodded, and retreated. The problem, as far as the system was concerned, no longer existed. The door closed. Silence flooded the house. Kesha stood frozen, unsure whether to breathe. Jamal clutched her leg. Zoe pressed her face into Kesha's shoulder. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension didn't dissolve, it transformed. Andrew turned around slowly. What he saw nearly broke him. Kesha wasn't relieved, she wasn't grateful, she was shaking. Her shoulders trembled as the weight of what had almost happened crashed down all at once. Years of fear, restraint, survival instincts, all colliding in a single moment where everything had nearly been taken again. Andrew realized something devastating then. Saving her in that moment did not erase the trauma. It didn't undo the harm of living constantly on the edge. It only exposed how fragile her safety had always been. Kesha finally spoke, her voice barely steady. "They were going to make us leave." Not a question, a statement of fact. Andrew nodded. He didn't try to minimize it, he didn't dress it up. "Yes," he said quietly, "they were." The truth hung between them, heavy and unavoidable. Jamal looked up, eyes wide, searching Andrew's face for answers he shouldn't have needed to ask. Andrew felt the responsibility settle fully onto his chest then, not as guilt, but as clarity. This was the turning point. Kesha took a step back, instinctively creating distance again. She had learned not to trust sudden reversals, not to mistake temporary safety for lasting change. Her gratitude was cautious, edged with fear. She had been spared for now. Andrew saw it and understood why. He had crossed one line, but the deeper injustice remained. Permission could be revoked. Power could shift. Safety based on someone else's authority was never real safety. The realization hit him harder than the heart attack ever had. That afternoon, Andrew sat alone in the living room while Kesha retreated upstairs with the children. The house felt different now, charged, exposed. The illusion that he could simply help without consequences had shattered. He wasn't an observer anymore. He was part of the machinery that decided who stayed and who was removed. And now that machinery had a conscience staring back at him. He thought about the men on the porch, about how easily they had accepted his word, about how little proof was required when power spoke. Then he thought about how much proof Kesha had needed, and how it still wouldn't have been enough. The injustice was no longer theoretical. It had stood at his door. Andrew realized this wasn't about generosity. It was about repair, about whether he would use his position to interrupt harm instead of benefiting from it, about whether he would let this moment pass as a one-time intervention, or allow it to fundamentally change how he moved through the world. Upstairs, Kesha sat on the edge of the bed holding Zoe, her hands still unsteady. Jamal paced, restless, trying to understand why adults could decide his life with a clipboard. Kesha felt anger rise beneath the fear, not at Andrew, but at the system that had placed her survival in his hands to begin with. She wondered how many times she would have to be saved before she was allowed to simply exist. When Andrew finally stood and walked upstairs, he felt the gravity of what came next. Words would matter. Decisions would matter more. He could retreat into comfort again, or step fully into the discomfort that justice demanded. He stopped outside the room. This was the point of no return. Because whatever he chose now would define the rest of the story, not just for Kesha and her children, but for himself. And as he lifted his hand to knock, one truth echoed louder than anything else. Doing nothing was no longer an option. Andrew stood outside the room longer than he meant to. His hand hovered inches from the door, fingers tense, heart heavy. For the first time in his life, he was afraid of what he was about to say, not because it might cost him money or reputation, but because it might demand something deeper, something permanent. Inside, Kesha wiped her face quickly when she heard footsteps. She straightened instinctively, bracing herself for whatever came next. She had learned never to appear too vulnerable when power was nearby. Jamal sat stiffly on the bed, trying to look brave. Zoe clung to her mother's shoulder, thumb in her mouth, sensing danger without understanding it. Andrew knocked softly and stepped in. The room felt smaller than before, charged, heavy with everything that had just happened. Andrew could feel the imbalance pressing down on him again, but this time he didn't retreat from it. He walked in slowly, deliberately, and closed the door behind him, not to trap them but to shut the rest of the world out. "I'm sorry," he said. The words sounded inadequate even as he spoke them. Kesha didn't respond right away. Apologies had come before. They rarely changed outcomes. She waited, eyes steady, expression guarded. Andrew took a breath. "What happened today, it shouldn't have happened at all. You shouldn't need my permission to exist safely, and I shouldn't be the reason your children get to sleep in a bed tonight." The honesty startled her. Andrew continued, his voice tightening. "I thought giving you time was kindness. I thought compromise was enough. But standing at that door, watching how easily they listened to me and how invisible you were, I realized something." He paused, choosing the words carefully. "I've been protected by this system my entire life, and you've been crushed by it." Kesha felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not trust, recognition. Andrew stepped closer, stopping well short of invading her space. "I don't want to be the man who fixes this for a moment and walks away feeling good about himself. I don't want this to be another story where someone like you survives because someone like me allowed it." The room was silent, except for Zoe's soft breathing. Andrew swallowed. "I want to do this differently." Kesha's heart pounded. She had heard versions of this before, promises that softened consequences but didn't remove them. She waited for the condition, the catch, the limit. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. Andrew met her eyes. "It means there is no deadline anymore. Not 2 weeks, not 11 days, no quiet countdown hanging over your head. You and your children are not temporary guests here." Jamal's head snapped up. Kesha's grip tightened around Zoe. "I can't accept charity," she said immediately, the words sharp with reflex. "I won't raise my children dependent on someone else's mercy." Andrew nodded. I wouldn't respect you if you did." That answer disarmed her. "This isn't charity," he continued. "It's responsibility. I helped build a world that makes your life harder and mine easier. I don't get to step away from that truth just because I'm uncomfortable." Kesha felt anger rise then, not explosive, but raw. "Do you have any idea what it feels like," she said, voice trembling, "to know that your children's safety depends on whether someone like you feels generous today?" Andrew didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He absorbed it. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do now, and I hate that it took this long." The room felt like it was holding its breath again, but this time something fragile and dangerous hovered beneath the surface. Hope. Andrew took one final step forward, his voice steady but resolute. "I want to help you find a permanent place, somewhere safe, somewhere close to Jamal's school, somewhere you choose, not what desperation forces you into. I'll cover the upfront costs, but you'll contribute what you can, not because you owe me, but because dignity matters." Kesha shook her head slowly, tears slipping free despite her effort to stop them. "People always help until it gets complicated," she said, "until it costs them something real." Andrew's reply was immediate, "Then let it cost me." The words landed like thunder. Jamal stared at Andrew, uncertainty warring with cautious hope. "Does that mean we don't have to leave?" he asked softly. Andrew crouched down so he was eye level with the boy. "It means you don't have to be afraid tonight, or tomorrow." Zoe reached out instinctively and placed her small hand on Andrew's sleeve. "Stay," she said simply. Something cracked open in Andrew's chest then, wide and irreversible. But even as the moment deepened, reality pushed back. Andrew knew this decision would not stay contained within the walls of the house. Lawyers, advisors, colleagues, people who had benefited from his silence would question his judgment. They would call it emotional, reckless, unnecessary. They would remind him of precedent, liability, expectations. And for the first time, he didn't care. Because what stood before him now wasn't a legal risk. It was a reckoning. Kesha, still overwhelmed, looked at him through tears. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why me?" Andrew straightened slowly. "Because if justice only happens when it's easy, then it isn't justice at all." The weight of that answer settled into the room. Outside, the world continued as it always had, unequal, impatient, indifferent. But inside that house, something fundamental had shifted. Power had been confronted. Silence had been broken. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. And as Andrew stood there, fully aware of the consequences waiting beyond the door, he understood that this moment, this choice, would define everything that came next. Because the hardest part wasn't opening the door to injustice. It was deciding what kind of man walked through it afterward. The room stayed quiet long after Andrew finished speaking. Not the empty quiet of avoidance, but the heavy kind. The kind that comes when words land too close to the truth. Kesha looked at him as if trying to determine whether this moment was real or just another fragile pause before disappointment. She had lived long enough to know that promises, even sincere ones, could collapse under pressure. Andrew didn't rush her. For once, he let silence do the work. Kesha finally sat down on the edge of the bed, her knees weak beneath her. Zoe shifted in her arms, already drifting towards sleep, unaware that her world had nearly been shattered hours earlier. Jamal stood near the window, staring outside as if checking whether the danger had truly passed. Children learned vigilance early when safety was conditional. "I don't trust this world," Kesha said at last, her voice low but steady. "Not because I want to be angry, because I've learned what happens when I let my guard down." Andrew nodded slowly. "You shouldn't have to trust me," he replied. "Not yet. Trust isn't something I get to ask for, it's something I earn or I don't." That answer mattered more than he realized. Kesha studied him carefully. She saw fear there, but not the fear of losing control. The fear of finally seeing clearly, and that scared her almost as much as hope did. Because clarity demanded change, and change often came with consequences. Andrew continued, his voice firming with resolve. This won't be quiet. People will question it. They'll say I'm being reckless. They'll say I'm overreacting to a situation that doesn't affect me. He paused. But it does affect me. It always has. I just chose not to see it. Outside the room, the house felt impossibly still, as if listening. Kesha felt a familiar instinct rise, the urge to protect herself by stepping back, by refusing what could be taken away. I don't want pity, she said. I don't want to be your redemption story. Andrew's answer came without hesitation. Then don't be your own story. I'm not trying to fix my conscience. I'm trying to fix what I can reach. The words struck her harder than anger ever could. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine it, not luxury, not comfort, but stability. A door that locked, a school that didn't change mid-year, a night of sleep without fear creeping in at dawn. The image was dangerous because it felt possible. But possibility had a cost. What happens when people find out, she asked. When they see a black woman and her children living under your protection, when they start asking why. Andrew exhaled slowly. Then they'll have to hear the answer. Kesha closed her eyes briefly, fighting the rush of emotion. She had spent years explaining herself to systems that never listened. The idea that someone with power might finally refuse to look away felt unreal. Downstairs, a phone buzzed on the counter. Andrew's. A message from an advisor. Missed calls from colleagues. The world pressing in, demanding his attention, ready to pull him back into the version of himself that had always been rewarded. Andrew didn't check it. That choice, small, deliberate, spoke louder than anything else he had said. Kesha noticed. Jamal turned from the window and stepped closer. Does this mean, he asked quietly, we don't have to keep moving again? Andrew felt the weight of the question settle deep in his chest. He answered carefully. It means I won't be the reason you're forced to. That was the most honest promise he could make. Kesha watched her son's shoulders relax just slightly, the tension easing in a way that broke her heart. Children should not carry that much uncertainty. She felt anger surge again, not at Andrew, but at the world that had required this conversation at all. She stood then, placing Zoe gently on the bed, and faced Andrew fully. Her voice shook, but it did not waver. If we do this, she said, it's on my terms too. I keep my work, I contribute. I make decisions for my children. I don't disappear into your shadow. Andrew met her gaze, agreed. The simplicity of his response stunned her. That was the moment the balance truly shifted, not because Andrew held power, but because he was choosing to share it without conditions. Outside, clouds gathered again, darker this time, as if the day itself sensed the turning point. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, a reminder that storms didn't always announce themselves before returning. Andrew knew this was not the end of the conflict. It was the beginning of a larger one. His choice would ripple outward through his business, his relationships, his identity. People would push back. Systems always did when challenged. But standing there, facing a woman who had survived more loss than he could comprehend and still chosen compassion when he was at his weakest, Andrew understood something with painful clarity. This was what accountability felt like. Not guilt, not charity, responsibility. Kesha picked up Zoe again and held her close, grounding herself in something real. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't relieved. She was bracing for what came next, but for the first time she wasn't bracing alone. Andrew stepped back toward the door, then stopped. He turned once more, his voice quiet but resolute. Whatever happens next, he said, I won't pretend I don't see it anymore. Kesha nodded slowly. Good, she replied, because once you see it, you don't get to unsee it. The words settled between them like a vow. As Andrew opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the house seemed to exhale, caught between fear and hope, injustice and resistance. The choice had been made. The line had been crossed. And now, with the world waiting just beyond the walls, the real consequences were about to begin. The days that followed did not unfold like a miracle. There was no sudden peace, no clean ending where everything felt fixed. Instead, there was work, slow, uncomfortable, necessary work. And for the first time in his life, Andrew Wellington did not try to escape it. The house settled into a new rhythm, not one of certainty, but of intention. Kesha stayed cautious, even as the immediate threat faded. Trauma does not vanish just because danger retreats. It lingers in the body, in the way shoulders tense at unfamiliar sounds, in the instinct to prepare for loss even during calm. Andrew noticed it in her, and instead of asking her to relax, he learned to respect it. True to his word, Andrew did not treat his decision as a private favor. He made it public where it mattered. He instructed his legal team to formalize protections, not loopholes, not temporary permissions, but safeguards that removed uncertainty. The same system that had nearly erased Kesha was now being forced, however slightly, to bend in her favor. Not because it had grown compassionate, but because power demanded it. Kesha insisted on contributing. She paid what she could on her terms. She kept her jobs. She made decisions for her children without asking permission. Andrew learned quickly that dignity could not coexist with control. Every time he felt the instinct to step in and handle something, he paused. He listened. He asked instead of assumed. That adjustment was not easy. Andrew faced resistance from every direction. Advisors warned him he was setting a dangerous precedent. Colleagues questioned his judgment. Some praised him quietly, others distanced themselves. A few accused him of being emotional, reckless, naive. Andrew recognized the irony immediately. Those same traits had never been questioned when they led to profit. But this time, the stakes were human. Andrew also faced himself. There were nights he lay awake, heart steady but mind racing, replaying moments from his past through a new lens. Projects he had approved without asking who would be displaced. Conversations where race was never mentioned, yet always present. He understood now that racism did not require hatred to function. It thrived on convenience, silence, and the comfort of people like him. Kesha, meanwhile, began to exhale, slowly, cautiously. The children returned to routines without constant interruption. Jamal stopped packing his backpack every night just in case. Zoe slept longer, deeper, her small body no longer bracing for uncertainty she couldn't name. These changes were subtle, but to Kesha, they were everything. Still, healing was uneven. Some days, Kesha felt gratitude so heavy it frightened her. Other days, resentment surfaced, not toward Andrew personally, but toward a world where safety required negotiation. She spoke honestly about it, and Andrew listened without defensiveness. He learned that accountability was not about being thanked. It was about staying present even when gratitude was absent. The relationship between them did not become simple or sentimental. It became real. They spoke openly about race, power, and fear, not as abstract concepts but as lived realities. Kesha shared stories she rarely voiced aloud. The looks, the assumptions, the way her competence was always questioned before her character. Andrew shared how rarely he had been forced to think about any of it. The contrast was uncomfortable, but they didn't soften it. That discomfort became the point. Andrew began using his influence differently. Not loudly, not performatively. He asked harder questions in meetings. He challenged decisions he once would have approved without thought. He redirected resources toward housing initiatives that centered stability instead of profit alone. These actions did not dismantle the system, but they disrupted it. And disruption mattered. Kesha eventually found a place of her own, not rushed, not compromised beyond safety. A modest home near Jamal's school, a neighborhood that didn't feel like a gamble. Andrew helped cover the barriers that so often keep people trapped: deposits, upfront costs, arbitrary requirements, but he did not control the outcome. Kesha chose. That distinction mattered more than money. The day they moved, there were no speeches, no tears, just quiet acknowledgement of what had been survived. Andrew stood in the now empty house afterward, feeling something he hadn't expected. Not relief, not loss, responsibility. The story hadn't ended just because the crisis had passed. If anything, it had begun. He understood now that justice was not a single moment of courage. It was a series of choices made long after the applause faded, choices that often went unnoticed, uncelebrated, and unshared. Kesha carried the experience with her too. It changed how she saw power, but it did not erase her skepticism. She taught her children that help could come, but that they deserved safety without needing it. She taught them to be grateful, but never silent about injustice. Jamal remembered the fear, but he also remembered the moment an adult chose not to look away. That memory mattered. This story was never just about one billionaire or one black mother. It was about proximity, about what happens when privilege is forced to witness the consequences of its comfort, about how racism persists not only through cruelty, but through systems that reward distance and punish vulnerability. Most injustices never arrive with drama. They arrive with paperwork, deadlines, policies described as neutral, and they continue because too many people with power believe doing nothing is the same as doing no harm. Andrew learned that it is. Kesha lived that truth long before he did. And the question this story leaves behind is not whether Andrew did the right thing once, but whether more people like him will choose discomfort over indifference when faced with the same moment. Because for every story where someone steps in, there are countless others where no one does. How many doors are closed quietly every day? How many lives are reshaped by decisions made without consequence for the decision maker? And how many of us would act differently if the injustice were standing in our own living room, asking to be seen? This story ends without a perfect resolution, because real life rarely offers one, but it leaves us with something more powerful than closure. It leaves us with responsibility, and the reminder that the smallest choice, made at the right moment, can interrupt a system built to ignore people like Kesha and protect people like Andrew. The question is no longer whether racism exists. The question is, when you see it up close, what will you do next?